and welcome back to Fossil versus Future. I'm Daisy.
And I'm James.
And today we're going to talk about
women and climate.
What about women? With International Women's Day on the 8th of March, we wanted to dedicate this episode to recognising women. I think there are two ways of asking this what about question. The first is, when climate change hits, what about women? Across the world, women and girls are disproportionately affected by climate change. They are more likely to live in poverty, more likely to depend directly on natural resources for food and income, and more likely to be responsible for securing water, food, and firewood for their families. As the climate changes and resources become scarce, women are forced to work harder and travel farther, and girls are often pulled out of school to help their mothers cope with the increased workloads. Women carry out at least 2.5 times more unpaid household and care work than men, and when climate disasters strike, floods, droughts, wildfires, they are often the first responders in their communities, trying to continue to provide shelter, food, and care for others. In natural disasters, women and children are 14 times more likely to die than men, not because they are inherently more vulnerable, but because they are less likely to have access to information, financial resources, mobility, and decision-making power. Climate shocks also increase violence against women and girls and restrict access to healthcare, including sexual and reproductive health services. But there is another, more hopeful way of asking the same what about question. What about women as part of the solution? Women are environmental stewards. In most developing countries, they produce 60 to 80% of the food and often demonstrate great adaptability to climate change. Women are also leading the way on climate action. Women are 2.5 times more likely to demand that their governments take action, more likely to vote with the environment in mind, and more likely to reduce their own carbon footprints. Research consistently shows that when women are in leadership, in government or business, climate policies are stronger and environmental outcomes improve. And yet, women remain underrepresented in the spaces where climate decisions are made. Empowering women is not just a matter of justice. It's essential for overcoming the obstacles we face.
So we thought we'd have this conversation in part because of that day of recognition, but also because climate change amplifies inequalities, risks, makes situations that we understand relatively well harder to manage. And we've seen this in lots of other circumstances and episodes that we've had, but also because of this leadership quality argument, the idea that female leadership helps resolve complex, long-term problems requiring cooperation, ways in which a broader societal view can be brought to bear on problems that perhaps a different kind of leadership would put to one side in favor of more immediate feedback for the leader themselves. And whilst probably we ought to be very wary of gender generalizations, there's strong evidence that you cited that female leadership does make a difference. And in some very particular areas, in investment, for example, what choices are made. In social organization, definitely. On boards, I would argue, very definitely. And that might be, I hope it's not just not merely experiential or anecdotal. I think it's pretty solidly supported by the evidence that the presence of women on boards makes a difference to what decisions are made, and in this case, a focus on solving complex problems relating to climate and environment. There is a specific difference in the way decisions are made, depending on who's on the board. The board composition makes a difference.
Yeah, I was lucky enough after university to spend 3 months living and working in Nepal. And that's when myself really seen the impact of climate change on women specifically. So the village that I was living in, the majority of the young men in the village had moved away to other countries like Qatar, for example, or work abroad so that they could send money back to their families, meanwhile leaving the women of the families at home to look after the house, to do all the subsistence farming. And so all this adaptability to climate change was falling on the shoulders of the women who were there. And most of the women that were there were also not living with their families, they were living with their husbands' families. So they had moved away from the villages where they grew up to live with their husbands' families and look after the children. So we were working with them on training and mainly around agriculture. How do you adapt your agricultural practices to a changing climate? And I was reading that women really have shown great adaptability, and often, unfortunately, because they don't have access to the same resources as men, they really have to be quite innovative. And often that comes hand in hand with being more sustainable in the way that they respond. So there was an example in Nigeria that my friend Esther Hodges was telling me about, where women have been using manure on the fields to adapt, whereas men would use pesticides because they have the financial resources to be able to access the pesticides, whereas women were having to use more sustainable methods. And unfortunately, there are other ways that women are more vulnerable in climate disasters. One study found that there's a 28% increase in femicide during heat waves, for example. Just because when people experience heat waves, it tends to bring on violent
Increase aggressive
behaviors.
behaviours, yeah.
Exactly. And then the example of when disasters strike, 86% of girls face an increased workload in their households as a result of having to adapt and help their mothers at home, and therefore they can't concentrate on their studies. And if girls aren't going to school, that then increases risks of child marriage, for example. In Bangladesh, 39% increase in child marriages directly linked to climate impacts. And that's for multiple reasons. But it just shows, like you say, James, that climate change really is exacerbating existing inequalities. And yeah, that
Well,
needs to be
we've long known,
recognized.
it's a frequently asked question, isn't it? What's the one thing you can do to improve the development prospects of a particular part of the world? And the answer is routinely educate girls. And there are enormous consequences from sustained programs of female education in terms of, obviously, reproductive rates and employment and ability to manage resources, and a whole series of knock-on consequences that just come from that one intervention in an economy or a society. But the other thing we did find from that Project Drawdown
Hmm.
series, there are lots of other responses to climate change that flow from elevating the role of women in society, giving them more autonomy and control over financial resources, for example. And certainly in some of the enterprises I've been involved with, female entrepreneurs, people delivering the solar kit to a house or managing the bill thereafter makes a difference. The default rates on loans,
Yeah, it's
right,
lower.
are much lower if the woman is in charge. And these are not small things, and we ought to be able to talk about them without falling into a culture war about women and girls versus men and boys, right? We ought to be able to address these strong evidentiary forces and understand how best to respond, rather than find ourselves in some kind of online spat with Jordan Peterson. We should be able to have a sensible conversation about this without having to wear a mantle saying woke, right?
Yeah.
So it seems to me that focus on women and girls makes sense if you're serious about dealing with climate change.
100%. So climate finance needs to be designed with women in mind, but also climate solutions more broadly. I think an example would be, for example, like public transport. So if you're thinking about encouraging communities to use public transport more, half the population are women. So have you designed that public transport solution in a way that women can afford to use it, or that women feel safe using it? And all these things need to be considered to ensure that the solution is truly effective. So having women as part of the decision making, having women at the table coming up with these solutions, as they so often really do understand their households, families, communities. They need to be part of the decision-making
Well,
process.
we all know this from our real lives. Women notice different things.
Yeah.
They tune into, if you've got children and there's some public space being developed, they'll know, where can I change a nappy? Where are the toilets? Right? Where
Ask different
they ask
questions.
different questions. They just do. And finding ways of bringing in that perspective early on will obviously alter decisions made, but also how they're implemented. And because one hopes people are serious when they have positions of power about making decisions in the real world for the people who live there, it makes sense to pay, particularly where you have an already existing inequality. And there may be cultural reasons for that. There may be a whole series of explanations as to why that is the case. But this particular problem is so large and so distributed that if you fail to bring in a perspective like that of a mother with young children when you're trying to plan a public space or deal with flood risk or something like that, you'll just make less good decisions. Simple as that.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of, unfortunately, women do tend to take a more traditional stay-at-home role in wealthier societies, and women drive 70 to 80% of all consumer purchasing decisions. So actually, the transition that we need to more sustainable lifestyles needs to involve women, because it's women that are going to the shops and buying the food. And women do tend to buy more organic food, and more sustainable products do tend to be marketed towards women for that
Yeah.
reason. But again, you're sort of exacerbating the existing inequalities by designing sustainable products to be marketed
Yeah.
to women. So,
But I think this also points to just deeper understanding of how decisions get made and who makes decisions and in what context.
mm,
I'm going to give you a slightly light-hearted but very important from a business point of view example from the world of cricket. When the Indian Premier League was just beginning, and they wanted to attract a wider audience to a different form of the game, a shorter form of the game. Apologies for those who don't follow cricket and don't know anything about it, but I'm
me
making
included.
I'm making a different point that's not really to do with cricket itself, but to do with marketing.
hmm
It was understood that in many Indian families, it is the woman of the house who owns the remote control.
Oh, really? Okay.
And the decision making as to what to watch is in their hands.
Okay.
And it became a very deliberate marketing ploy for the Indian Premier League to pitch cricket, that form of cricket, to women. And they did that via Bollywood. So they literally handed ownership over to Bollywood stars
hmm
who were loved and admired by a female audience. And they promoted the game to that audience, and it worked. And if you look at the audience in any Indian Premier League match, just let your eyes scan around the ground if you're watching at all, but believe me, it's quite fun. But if you look at the audience, huge numbers of women, lots of women on a night out, so there'll be the whole row of women, lots of women in their kids, lots of young girls, completely different audience
Very interesting.
than in the past, and a different audience than you'd see at Test cricket, a different form of the game. But there was an understanding that in that culture, there was a decision maker that was female that had to be pitched to. So, I mean, it's just an example of just sort of getting deeper understanding of where decisions get made and how decisions get made. In that case, had a very big business consequence, but not
Yeah.
hugely relevant to climate change. But nonetheless, that's a smart way of dealing with how decisions are made.
I think part of the reason that women are buying these products as well is that men perhaps see sustainability and shopping sustainably as a bit soft, not very masculine thing to do. I think veganism is supposed to be an example of that. So I don't know whether there is a bit of another reframing that we need around
I think
climate
there is,
change.
because that starts to push towards absurdity, doesn't it? That's why, by the way, you get in the backlash, the anti-woke backlash
Mhm.
that comes from the kind of online influencers and indeed politicians. What is it that they really focus on? Meat, cars,
Meat and cars, and women tend to have a lower carbon footprint for that
meat,
reason.
cars, and the idea of a sort of feminization of society. And men and boys are belittled.
Mhm.
Right? That is a powerful force. And it's a dangerous one,
Yeah.
especially if you are in a society where there is relatively high male unemployment, where there are inactive men who are not using their energies productively. Very easy to find an angry army of young men who will blame society generally, maybe particularly women, for their situation. And that does affect discussions about climate and what to do, whether it's a problem and how you should deal with it, has got a gender split, as indeed, you see in elections of various kinds in various parts of the world. There is a split. There's an age, we've talked about before, about age, different ages responding to climate change in
Mhm.
different ways, but it's also gender.
Yeah, misogyny plays a role in climate denial because the traditional male-dominated industrial society is threatened by
Yeah,
some of the climate solutions. So there is this nervousness about the transition and that,
yeah.
yeah,
I mean, some
male-led
of it we've talked about
society.
before. It really makes no sense. That's quite hard to deal with because it's so weirdly blinkered and hard to fathom. So one of the things that is quite obvious in countries where there's a culture associated with, if you like, male domination of the land.
Yeah.
You see it clearly in the States, in Canada, and Australia, and it often focuses on minerals and mining and fossil fuels, on the bravery, camaraderie, like men mining stuff to sell that creates wealth, and the sense that talking about climate change undermines them, their masculinity, their status. And yet we've talked about this over and over again. The energy transition needs minerals. In many instances, the same tasks are required, the same engineering skills. It takes there's risk and solidarity and common enterprise and mateship involved in offshore wind,
Mhm.
right? It's not that you can't have women in that story too, but my point is that this is a ludicrous all or nothing, one side or other side conversation when the materials we need to move away from fossil fuels and power our economies and prosper require many of the same skills. Where is the loss of pride in making, in innovating, in all the stuff that maybe that idea of maleness feels threatened by? Where is still required, right? All of
Yeah.
those attributes are still required. They're not being belittled. And the emphasis shift is quite modest. So you're not mining this, you're mining that. You're not building this, you're building that. Inventing this, taking risk, all of those things. If you're worried about your maleness, that it's still needed.
Yeah.
All of it. It's
Yeah.
not under threat.
But we need to bring everyone else along
Yeah,
too. Yeah.
yeah. You could be brave and not male. I think so. Often I have an image of female leadership that I have to confess is influenced by who I'm married to, right? I mean, a female leader.
Yeah.
A female leader who doesn't put herself forward, who is selected by others, who has huge capacity for work, tremendous concentration, and a really strong moral core, understanding right and wrong, fairness, that can cope with responsibility, that sees long-term interests and doesn't take for herself in the short term. Those are attributes that we crave in solving a problem like climate change. It's not her field.
100%.
She works in another field. But those are leadership qualities that I would like to see, and sadly are often not present in another kind of leadership that does seem to succeed, at least in getting to the top, but is much more short-term, much more self-referential, much more to do with something good for me and my followers now.
Yep.
And you know what? You can't reinvent all of our electoral systems all at the same time. But I think you can advocate for a style of leadership, a type of leadership that is better suited to actually solving complex problems rather than promoting themselves as some kind of savior that can deal with what is often an hysterical response to these complex problems. And that may or may not be a female, but there are characteristics that are more often than not associated with female leadership rather than male.
Yet in every level of society, we still it's improved, but we still lack women in leadership positions. 29 countries have women serving as heads of state and or government as of September 2025. In the climate agenda, women did play a pivotal role in the Paris Agreement. I guess Christiana Figueres, Mia Mottley, for example.
The lionesses, that's what they were called.
There we go.
I think I know them all. And they are amazing. And they
Yeah.
did work together. Okay, I'm going to sum this up in a way that is personal and could be challenged, but here it goes. I don't think there could have been a group of male leaders who would have behaved that way. I think it was a uniquely feminine response to a leadership need. The way they cooperated, the solidarity they built amongst them across generations, cultures, countries, all coming from different parts of the world, different levels. They were all leaders in their own right, but in different domains. And they were very effective at collaborating. Now, the harsh truth is they've collaborated to get an international agreement that's now in the crosshairs of a lot of very powerful men,
Mm-hmm.
right, who want to break it up.
Yeah.
So that's a reality check. But I know who did that work. I know how they did it. And it was brilliant. It worked. And it worked both inside an institution like the UN, but also around the edge. They worked in and out. It was personal. They kept close to each other, great loyalty and friendship. But they were also open to bringing in people who were not who they didn't know so well. And they were also a small group, which tells you that small groups can make a big difference, right? I mean, I think there'd be some doubt about where the edges of the group were, and that's normal. But I would say that it was probably in the order of a dozen people
Mm-hmm.
who very effectively worked together to get an international agreement on climate change. Now, of course, lots of other people involved too, but I'm making
Yeah.
the point that that was a leadership group, all women, all connected, still connected to this day, even though some of them have quite sharply different views about what we should do. It was impressive.
Because there is evidence that if there's a bigger share of women in parliament, they're more likely to ratify international climate treaties, for example. But apparently in our COP26 delegation, there were 10 out of 12 men for the UK. Um, So,
Is that right? I
yeah.
hadn't clocked that. I think in the Friends of COP group I was a part of, I don't know what the exact, I could look it up on my WhatsApp group. There were plenty of women in that group, and plenty of the same women, well,
Okay,
some of the
that's
same women,
reassuring.
um, who are part of the Lionesses. Anyway, I think these are meaningful insights into understanding the nature of the problem, figuring out how a set of solutions might emerge, and then building the power resources to make decisions and get things done practically. And persuasively, in the sense that staying in a conversation long enough to figure out also how hard it is, and that the trade-offs have to be done, and the compromises that have to be made, and the way in which to carry with you points of view that are antithetical. And that's, again, I feel slightly awkward about the gender generalization, but not about the type of leadership. And partly because I also recognize that these characteristics can be found in men, right? So, and I'm all in favor of fluidity, but I just think it's a good way of assessing what kind of leadership matters, what kind of leadership works with a problem like this one.
And as of 2023, we now have more women CEOs in the US than CEOs called John. So
Is that right?
that's a win.
Where do you get that from?
Yeah,
Um,
only a couple of years ago did that switch. And despite only 3.27% of the US population being called John, there were still more John CEOs.
That's a beaut.
Yeah.
The board composition thing is serious.
Mhm.
I once wrote down a list, and I did it instantaneously for show. I had headhunters that I used to advise. I wrote down 50 names of women who should be on boards
Mhm.
but aren't.
Okay.
And in that list of 50 names, very experienced, very good, very effective, who knew about this space, environment and sustainability and climate and energy, right? That was his specialization. There are only 2 names that he recognized in that 50. And that's because his clients have not been asking him, and because these skills and attributes and knowledge sets have not been widely recognized as relevant, but also because many of those women have not been promoting themselves in
Yeah.
the same way that men do.
Not quite that same
Right.
competitiveness.
And now I don't know whether in the world of social media and AI enhancement and Lord knows what else, whether that situation is getting better or worse. I really don't know. It'd be worth asking. The capacity for men to self-promote effectively is high as compared. There is a relative difference between how women behave and how men behave when seeking promotion. But there's also no doubt in my mind and my experience, and I think it's well supported, that if you build boards that have good representation from women, you make different, and I would argue in this context, better decisions. And unfortunately, this is absolutely caught up in the woke, anti-woke culture war. So it's really difficult to have that conversation without being branded in favor of DEI and somehow discounted immediately,
Yeah.
right?
We're speaking about women, but there's
Yeah,
so much evidence of
yeah.
diversity more broadly, really
So,
supporting
so in the
business
backlash, particularly in the
goals.
States, but it's over here too, we've lost, for now, I'm sure it will revert at some stage, but for now, we've lost the sensible space for figuring out how best to compose a decision-making board without there being some DEI woke controversy associated with the decision-making, which is a real shame. And no doubt, there were some absurdities associated with the DEI movement, for want of a better word. I mean, of course, there's been an overreach. There's been some poor decisions taken on the basis of a readjustment of what was also an obvious inequality. But now we've lost sensible common ground for working stuff out, and we need to get it back.
Yeah. I think the point around women and risk is very interesting. Apparently, men and women largely both agree that climate change is real and human caused, but women consistently perceive greater personal risk and greater risk for others, including future generations,
Yeah.
than men. So women have been proven to become more supportive of climate policies when they're prompted to think about future generations, whereas men, it stays the same. And whether that is women having a more caring nature
Well,
or
that's always a difficult territory for me.
yeah.
I'm not so sure about that, but I could see something very deep-rooted in the connection between generations that a woman can feel because of her capability to produce a child, a reproductive,
Mhm.
the carrying of a child,
Yeah.
and it's qualitatively different from a male's contribution to the formation of that life. I mean,
Mm.
surely we can agree that. Actually, you put me in mind of a brilliant moment in my very early career on climate change at the Second World Climate Conference in Geneva in 1990. And we were just beginning to represent the small island states. And I'd been working on this idea called the precautionary principle, and I'd written academic articles about it, and I was advocating its use, and it became one of the key elements of the manifesto that the small island states created, and we promoted it heavily. And it was controversial because it contains a shift in the burden of proof. Once you've raised the risk of serious or irreversible harm, and then you shift the burden to those who are practicing the activity that causes the harm, um, to prevent, to stop. And it was fiercely resisted by countries, including the United States. And we in the small island states organized quite well to promote the use of the precautionary principle in the climate context. And at one point, we got sort of stuck inside negotiations. And in our small negotiating group, we were sent away by the chair to try and agree a form of words. It was a woman from the Argentinian delegation who was heavily pregnant, like really visibly pregnant. And when we went back into the hall and showed our work and tried to get the consensus built again, she spoke up and she said very simply, the precautionary principle is about future generations. And everyone looked at
Mm.
her. And
It's powerful.
it worked.
Yeah.
I mean, it amuses me to think about it now because of my experience then and how it did actually shift the conversation. But there's something profound about it. It's basically true that
Mhm.
the precautionary principle is about future generations, and using the precautionary principle to deal with climate change is about future generations. And having a pregnant woman say it makes more of a difference than if I had said it. And it makes more of a difference because it resonates with us as humans, because it's true, right?
Yeah.
So something about that scene, which I can now recall with such clarity, and I was very young at the time.
I think it's a balance because we're not trying to frame climate as something that women need to need to
Or only
solve.
women, yeah,
Yeah,
that would be
exactly.
silly.
It's not
Yeah.
on we're not putting this on women's shoulders. We're just trying to give women the more power in decision making in these climate arenas to have their voice, their needs considered. So I think it's once again, it's about justice, and we need to bring everyone along with the climate solutions and not just focus on a small minority.
Yeah, and also I think the way you framed it at the beginning is right,
Hmm.
right? It's another amplification issue.
Yeah.
That there are real consequences, and we can see who carries the burden.
Burden.
There is also a leadership role in solving the problem, and it's a particularly complex problem that requires cooperation, requires some long-term thinking, and is not adequately addressed by an aggressive I win, you lose style of leadership. And I think those are reasonable insights, but they're also hopefully ways of motivating a response between generations and genders that increase the possibility of us fixing this problem in a way that is
Yeah.
broadly optimistic, because I think there are enough examples of how successful we are when we do build groups of actors around leaders who think and behave that way.
Yeah. So helping to solve gender equality will put us in the right direction for climate action.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening to Fossil versus Future. Please subscribe to our podcast and give us a rating. And please follow us on social media. Let us know the what about questions that you want us to discuss.